Everyone. Good morning to all in the United States, and good afternoon to those joining us today from Europe, Turkey, and around the region. As the director of the Atlantic Council in Turkey and on behalf of the Atlantic Council, it is my pleasure to host this important and timely discussion on the implications to Turkey of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. Military buildup of Russia on the Ukrainian border and in the Black Sea has raised concerns in the US, Europe, and NATO, as well as in Turkey. The West is scrambling with the real prospect of an open conflict, which could have serious consequences to the liberal international order, the security of Europe, and future of NATO. Turkey is uniquely positioned across the Black Sea with a historic and strategic interest in Ukraine and for balancing Russia. Turkey and Ukraine have developed an increasingly warm strategic partnership marked by important cooperation on defense. On the other side, Turkey has balanced a complex relationship with Russia, marked by cooperation, especially economic relations and energy, and also competition in various arenas across the region, including Syria, the South Caucasus, and Libya. In the current tensions between Russia and Ukraine, Turkey has been keen to avoid conflict and persistently encouraged a dialogue. Today, Turkey's President Erdogan is in Kiev for talks with Ukrainian counterpart in part of a concerted effort to defuse the tensions and mediate. Later this month, Russian President Putin is expected to visit Ankara for talks. I'm greatly looking forward to hearing our distinguished panelists to discuss the strategic and security implications of the tensions and potential conflict to Turkey and Turkey's role in finding a settlement. It is my pleasure to host a terrific panel with Transatlantic Leadership Network Mediterranean Basin, Middle East and Gulf Initiative Distinguished Energy Fellow Debra Kaygan, Carleton University Central in Modern Turkish Studies Non-Resident Senior Fellow Yevgenia Gaber, and EDAM Director of Security and Defense Studies Program Can Kasaboğlu. Without further ado, I'm pleased to hand the floor to our moderator, dear Matt Riza, our non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Turkey and Global Energy Center, who previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Europe and Eurasia, as well as Ambassador to Azerbaijan of the United States. Matt, thank you for moderating this panel. Floor is yours.
Yeah, thanks so much, Daphne, for the honor of participating in the context of a moderator tonight on this discussion that I can't wait to hear. I'll draw out as many interesting points as possible, but I'm here really hopefully to learn a lot more than I know right now. But before we begin, there are a few housekeeping notes I'd like to share. First of all, everybody, this event is public. It's on the record, no Chatham House rule. And we encourage you to engage with us on Twitter using the handles at @A_C_Istanbul and at Atlantic Council. Don't worry if you didn't get those. Grady Wilson, our fantastic partner and colleague, will send a message around to the entire group. And of course, at the end of our event, we'll respond to questions from the audience. When you're posing your question, please write it in the Q&A box, not in the chat, but in the Q&A box, along with your name, your title, your affiliation as well. Anonymous questions, as is always the case with our Atlantic Council events, won't be answered. And of course, audience questions will be addressed at the end of our panel, but please begin submitting your questions as early as possible, because I think the discussion could be more interesting if I can integrate those questions as we go, when ones pop up that are relevant to that point in the conversation. So, Turkey. What are the implications for Turkey of the Russia-Ukraine crisis? Or maybe flip it around. What are the implications for the Russia-Ukraine crisis of Turkey and its worldview and its aspirations to be a recognized regional player in quite a region, in a region that, of course, makes it a Black Sea NATO member? By the way, as an aside, I'd note that I was reading a recent international, highly regarded publication's discussion of the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and it discussed two NATO members that are on the Black Sea, Romania and Bulgaria, but there is this other one called Turkey that has NATO's second largest military. Turkey has an image of itself at least under this current government, as, and this may be surprising to many in our audience, especially in Washington and perhaps in Brussels, as an island of stability in a chaotic world and as a stabilizing force. And the director of communications for President Erdogan, that's Fahrettin Altun, he has a new book out that is exactly about this subject, that Turkey believes it is generating stability in the Eastern Mediterranean, though our Greek friends and Greek Cypriot friends and many, again, in Washington or Brussels may feel differently. Turkey feels it's contributing to stability in Syria, especially northwest Syria, in Idlib province, where Turkey and Russia in late 2019 signed an agreement to protect the civilian population that had fled there, which Russia has subsequently bombed repeatedly. And Turkey sees itself as the only NATO member that actually confronted Russia on the battlefield, utilizing its innovative drone technologies, integrated with innovative tactics, standoff artillery strikes that fought Russian forces and Assad forces to a standstill. So from Turkey's perspective, Turkey was playing a stabilizing role there, as it was in Libya, where Turkey supported the Government of National Accord, the UN-recognized government, and again, using its innovative drone technologies and tactics, fought Russian troops, granted, Wagner group, mercenaries, to a standstill in the 2020, May of 2020. Well, we'll discuss whether or not Turkey really is a stabilizing force and can be in the case of the Russia-Ukraine crisis right now. Turkey has offered repeatedly to be a moderator or a mediator of that conflict. President Erdogan is in Kiev right now, having just landed. He insisted on going ahead with this long-planned visit, even though the Russian side had expressed concern that somehow this would lead to instability. But stability or instability is in the eye of the beholder. I mean, President Putin is planning a trip to Beijing shortly to see Xi Jinping, and he's saying he's doing that in this as a sign of how Russia and China together are contributing to global stability. So where you stand is where you sit. So I'd like to turn for our first set of questions to a dear friend of mine, Deborah Kagan, whom I've known for 31 years. I'm turning to her not only because of that, not only because we're fellow Chicagoans, but because Deborah, as you heard in Daphne's introduction, is an expert on energy in the Caspian region and the Middle East and beyond. And in fact, it's those issues that brought me to Turkey, as well as to the South Caucasus and Central Asia back in the late 1990s. So Deborah, during the past 20 years, during that period, 20 plus years, in fact, Turkey has made major strides in helping both itself and Turkey's European allies diversify their supplies of natural gas, which means away from overdependence on Russia. Russia, nevertheless, remains not only an important gas supplier to Turkey, but in some years, the largest one. 2 years ago, of course, Azerbaijan ended up supplying more gas to Turkey than did Russia. And in fact, the United States ended up supplying an equivalent amount of natural gas in the form of LNG. But regardless, Russia remains a very important supplier of natural gas to Turkey. And as we speak, Russia and Turkey are engaged in negotiations on whether or not or how they'll renew their natural gas supply contracts, which are coming at least are expiring now. So who has leverage over whom? Does Moscow have more leverage over Ankara as the supplier of this critically important commodity, natural gas? Or does Ankara have more leverage over Moscow, given that Turkey is the second largest consumer of Russian natural gas as an export after Germany? What do you think?
Thank you very much, and good morning and afternoon and evening, wherever anyone is. And thank you for that lovely introduction. I appreciate it. I want to start by just quoting a couple of facts, because we all have participated in these discussions and there's lots of opinions, but I like to draw on a couple of facts. And the first is that Turkey imported an additional 63% of gas from Russia last year. Russia has gone back to being Turkey's largest supplier of gas. This is the result of poor planning on a lot of countries who didn't think the economies were going to rebound this quickly from the pandemic. And so that's an important point. The second point is that Iran, because of pipeline issues, has cut off 11% of Turkey's gas. They claim the pipeline will be finished, but as Matt and I have discussed before, some of this is, it could be Turkey not paying its bills on time, and Iran, unlike Russia, is unwilling to float a loan because they really want that hard currency. The third piece of this is that Turkey has had to shut down some of its manufacturing sectors for 2, 3, 4 days at a time in order to keep the flow of electricity going to homes, especially during the winter time. And then Turkey spends over $40 billion annually on imports of energy, another important point. And then finally, I do think that Turkey and Gazprom are about to ink an agreement that would run about 4 years if they haven't already inked it. I think there's not been a lot of transparency about the actual signing of that agreement, but it would be it would give Turkey higher flows of gas from Russia, substantially higher than what it's been receiving annually from them. And then the last piece is on Azerbaijan, who has just inked a 3-year deal with Turkey on these flows. Now, I'm going to say one other quick thing. Turkey's dependence on spot markets from places like the United States, from Qatar and other countries doesn't work anymore because the spot market prices for LNG are quite high now as a result of a worldwide gas shortage because producers were not producing that much during the pandemic and reserves were terribly low. And so add that into the equation. Turkey doesn't have that competitive piece that it did from around 2018 through 2020 of being able to fill up with spot market pricing because it was cheaper than the longer term contracts that, for example, Russia was offering. So that's off the table now. And so I think that's why that agreement with Russia is going to be signed for a longer term contract, probably at higher prices, but I don't think Turkey has an alternative. So I'll just put those things out there to say that Russia has a bit more leverage than it did even a year and a half ago.
Okay. Yeah, and from my private sector life, I mean, I know that there are a lot of gas flows that are trying to make their way to Turkey, but as you say, spot prices are high, and record high right now, and the producers are loving it. But one thing that's happened recently is that Azerbaijan and Iran and Turkey have reached an agreement on swaps. So Azerbaijan will ship, Turkmenistan will ship a certain volume of natural gas to Iran. Iran will ship that same volume from a different set of pipelines to Azerbaijan, and Azerbaijan will send that on to Turkey and to Europe. So there are very creative ways that are being undertaken to try to get more gas flowing toward Turkey and beyond. And in fact, this is really relevant right now as Europe worries about whether or not Russia can use the threat of a natural gas cutoff as leverage. So it's been reported that the Biden administration is now engaging Qatar. I mean, the Sheikh just visited, or President Biden just spoke with him about Qatari LNG supplies making their way toward Europe. And again, I just talked about the Azerbaijani supplies, which really kind of would be Turkmenistani supplies swapped by Iran, which may or may not garner support in Washington. But to what extent can these additional supplies, whether it be from Qatar, which you mentioned, and Azerbaijan, make their way via Turkey to Europe to help mitigate European fears at this crisis moment of a Russian cutoff?
I think the one piece in all of this that's missing, and many people here today probably know this, is that there is an international gas shortage. It's not finite. So even the Azeris working with these swaps understand that they cannot one for one, they just don't have enough gas to replace what Russia would supply. So I think one of these, what the Russian term was, pakhazuka, right? The little shell game here is that somehow Qatar and others can make up these supplies. And I don't think that's factually accurate right now because Qatar's pushing out at almost 90% of total production value. And they have long-term East Asia Pacific contracts that they're not going to break over this. because again, most of the European consumers were buying on the spot market, and Qatar, like every other producer, would like to tie people's feet to longer term predictable pricing for anything from 3 to 5 year contracts. So I think there's a lot of wishful thinking going on. But if you look at the numbers, there just isn't enough natural gas that was produced. And if you look at the numbers of profits made by some of the spot producers, by American companies, by other global concerns, these are profits no one has seen since 2016. They are enormous profits just over the past year because they were not digging new wells. They did not produce more gas. And a lot of this is the Europeans' problem of their own making because they didn't buy during the downturn like China did, and they didn't build reserve stocks because there was this push-pull of, oh, gee, we're going to go green tomorrow, but then all of a sudden the wind didn't blow and the sun didn't shine, and there wasn't enough of it. So I think at the heart of this is this sense of denial that there is a shortage, in part by poor planning of countries that did not build reserves. Turkey has some reserves and they're building more of it, which was smart. Ukraine, in fact, has 8 reserve locations, so they were actually better off than Europe, ironically, in all of this. But that was part of it. And the other part of it, when you're telling major producers that you're going to be switching from you're going to be switching over to renewables, no one was inclined to go do new fracking, open new wells, do more production when they weren't going to get paid for the price of investment in those objects.
Right. Yeah, no, good point on gas storages. And I think the Europeans also failed to refill their gas storages this summer, in part because Russia and Gazprom refused to sell above their contracted values. So to be fair to Gazprom, which is not a phrase I've uttered very often in my life, but to be fair, Gazprom did fulfill all of its contractual obligations to European consumers. But what they refused to do was to bring more gas on the spot market, as Fatih Birol, the head of the International Energy Agency, has pointed out. And they own many of the gas storage facilities in Germany, meaning they being Russians, and didn't top them off. So I agree with you, Deborah, very much so, that Russia has a lot of leverage in this situation. At the same time, I think Russia wants to make sure it avoids alienating consumers in Europe and Turkey in the future. So, a gas cutoff is a double-edged sword. Be that as it may, we'll come back to the energy questions in a moment, but I think it's important that our audience understands that Turkey plays an important role in providing an alternative way for natural gas to get to Europe, the so-called Southern Corridor. The Southern Corridor may be able to provide additional volumes if the EU succeeds in Baku in finding a creative way to get more volumes, but I share Deborah's pessimism that it doesn't seem like significant volumes are going to be available. So Moscow has this double-edged card, pardon the mixed metaphor, to play. A lot of leverage, but you could alienate your customers into the future as a huge amount of natural gas comes on stream in the market over the course of the period, a year or so from now, with a lot of LNG projects coming on stream. But let's shift for now toward more the historical and the current relationships among Turkey, Russia, and Ukraine. And especially, let's shift to Ukraine right now. And I'd like to ask Evgenia a question, which is, during the last 18 months or so, Turkey and Ukraine have established a burgeoning partnership in military technologies. And this has included sales of Turkey's Bayraktar drones from the Baykar company, which, by the way, is headed by a son-in-law of President Erdogan, which is significant for something I'll mention in a moment, as well as warships or stealth frigates that Ukraine has purchased. And then Ukraine is providing and helping Turkey develop jet engines for its military aircraft, especially its helicopters. Meanwhile, Turkey is condemning and has consistently condemned Russia's annexation of Crimea. It staunchly supports the future NATO membership of Ukraine as well as Georgia. But I recall a conversation I had in mid-2014 with a very senior former Turkish government official, very senior. And I was telling him how I had just visited, I was in Kyiv, but met with the head of the Crimean community. And I said, they're expecting even more support from Turkey. He said, oh, yes, of course. Those Crimean Tatars in Ukraine, they're our brothers and sisters. I said, why are you going to provide more assistance? And he said, well, how can we? Going back to our conversation with Deborah just now, because Turkey's so dependent on Russian gas. So, Turkish foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia has been a mix, as Daphne said in the opening, a mix of cooperation, especially on economic matters, and that gets back to the Baykar company, which economically people do well in Turkey. Very important people do well in Turkey if drone sales are happening. Those drone sales to Ukraine provide a deterrent to Russian military adventurism in Ukraine, as we know from early December, when President Putin complained to President Erdogan in a phone call about the use by Ukraine of one of those Bayraktar drones to take out a separatist howitzer that was, of course, a Russian howitzer. So with this push-pull of cooperation with Russia and confrontation or competition when necessary, um, what do you think? Is there a strategic partnership between Ukraine and Turkey, as evidenced by President Erdogan's visit today? And if it already exists, or if it's developing, how significant do you think it is?
Well, thank you, Matt. Those are really great questions, especially given that Turkey has at least officially a strategic partnership both with Ukraine and Russia. And the first question I generally get from experts is how come Turkey can be strategic partner of Georgia, Ukraine, and Russia at the same time, given that those countries are in the state of war among themselves. But that's how it works. And the timing for this discussion is just perfect because as we speak now, we have two presidents, Zelensky and Erdogan, signing a series of really important new treaties and new strategic documents here in Kiev within the framework of the high-level strategic council, which is happening right now. So we have Minister of Defense, Minister of Foreign Affairs in Kiev, and almost all political leadership of Turkey here in Ukraine. And among those treaties is a free trade agreement, which is a much negotiated and a long expected one. But also, at least we expect that a number of agreements will be signed on cooperation in military technologies, including the one that will give an opportunity to build joint production capacities for actually joint production of drones here in Ukraine. So that will not be only a case of a commercial deal of buying or purchasing those drones from Turkey and then equipping them with Ukrainian engines, as you mentioned, but also a joint production for third markets as well. So if I can speak on behalf of Ukraine, and that's kind of a general conventional wisdom, we do see Turkey as a strategic partner because of the political support we generally get, because of the diplomatic support, including the non-recognition of the illegally annexed Crimea, support for the Crimean Tatars, and also cooperation in defense sphere and in economic sphere. But that's also because I believe we have shared threats and shared interests here. So when Turkey helps Ukraine, it just not only helping Ukraine because it loves Ukraine, but also because the threat of Russia is shared for Ukraine and Turkey. And the growing military buildup of Russia here in the Black Sea, for example, and the militarization and nuclearization of Crimea also poses a threat to Turkey as well. So I would say that for Turkey, Ukraine is now a very good chance, a very good opportunity to counterbalance Russian presence and Russian growing influence here without being directly involved in a confrontation with Russia per se, and also without getting more NATO countries, more NATO navies involved in the Black Sea region. Because with this kind of a regional ownership approach, which you mentioned, Ukraine is a perfect choice and the perfect case for Turkey to actually display its constructive role here. A last point I will make here is how far it can go actually, because all those points which have been mentioned and have been made so far about how much Turkey is dependent on Russia in terms of gas supplies, in terms of Akkuyu, NPP, for example, in terms of Turk Stream, Blue Stream, and so on, but also in terms of like S-400s and also important argument in its dialogue with Washington and with the Brussels. That's another story. So every time we get this new stage of cooperation between Ukraine and Turkey, there are really very strong messages and signs from Russia, starting from embargo on Turkish agricultural products and up to the ban for Russian tourists to visit Turkey, and up to using Syrian migrants on the borders with Turkey just to create another humanitarian crisis and actually damage Turkish economy. So that's a bunch of different leverages which Russia can and will use in case Turkey becomes too much of a pro-Ukrainian. The problem is it's not only for Turkey to actually bring those two leaders to the same table of negotiations, but also to get an accord from Russia to actually be involved in that format. Because as far as I can see it now, it's not what Russia wants. Direct dialogue with President Biden, or at least with the NATO leadership, is what Putin really wants. And he obviously does not need President Erdogan as a mediator in between Ukraine and Russia.
I want to come back in a moment, Evgenia, to drill down a little bit deeper on the issue of whether Turkey really could play a mediating role. But you raised some crucial points there about, well, in this case, about Turkey's dependence on Russian export markets for its agricultural goods. And I guess tourism is an export market as well, technically. And you know, I recall after the November 2015 shoot down of that Russian fighter jet that was momentarily over Turkish territory just north of Syria, Russia did cut off those exports. And even after President Erdogan made sort of his non-apology apology, still Russia did not allow tomato exports to resume to Russia. And that may sound sort of farcical or comical, but that was a big deal for Turkish farmers, especially those who are greenhouse farmers around Antalya and Alanya, where Turkish Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu hails from. So Russia has been very effective at sending signals in terms of economic levers toward Ankara. And I think sometimes, you know, it's in Washington or Brussels, it seems that Turkey is trying to thread the needle and find a middle path that seems like it's not choosing sides, and a NATO ally should choose one side or the other. But what you've just explained, Evgenia, is why, as throughout history, Turkey has tried to find a way both to compete and to coexist or even cooperate with Russia economically. But before we get too much into the history, which I want to do in the next round, I want to turn to John Kasapoğlu, who is somebody, everybody, who knows more about Turkey's drone technologies and military technologies than anybody I've ever met. And John, so just a brief question, and as long an answer as you wish to provide, but how significant a defensive and a deterrent capability do you believe those Turkish drones provide Ukraine at this tense moment?
Thank you, Matt, and thanks for the kind intro. Well, actually, my very short answer in a nutshell would be depends. Depends on the scenario, depends on the setting, because this is why we have war games and large-scale drills. They're all centered on a specific scenario. The longer answer is, if we are talking about countering and pounding the Russia-backed separatists in Donbass, I would say lessons learned show us that it would make a great difference. Turkey had a great success. Turkey achieved a great success in asymmetric conflicts like that over ISIS, over PKK and its offshoots. These rebels in Donbass, they have no electronic warfare capability, organic on their own, in the absence of or without backing of the Russian Federation. They don't have an edge in the electromagnetic spectrum. They don't have state-of-the-art anti-drone capabilities. So if we were not witnessing what's happening in the Russia-Ukraine border right now, if it was just all boiling down into an asymmetric warfare setting, a counterterrorism operation setting, it would have made a great difference. Now, conventional setting is a different story. We saw in two cases that Turkish drones made a real difference. One is Operation Spring Shield, I mean, the punitive campaign by the Turkish military at the outset of 2020 against the Syrian Arab Army Northern deployments, and of course, the Second Karabakh War. The thing is, the armed forces of the Russian Federation and the current buildup that we are witnessing is neither the Syrian Arab Army nor the Armenian occupation formations. There are few issues to touch upon to just grasp the issue better. First, there are prerequisites for drone warfare. One is having an upper hand in the electromagnetic spectrum, as I said, having the information superiority and better situational awareness of the picture of the battleground better than your adversary, I doubt Ukraine has that upper hand, that advantage over the Russian Federation. Second, in the both Turkey and Azerbaijani cases, these drones were used in a network-centric warfare architecture. What I mean by that, they were integrated into land-based fires, artillery pieces, and multiple launch rocket systems. In Syria, Turkey used Coral electronic warfare envelopes and integrated that into drone warfare assets. Turkish AWACS aircraft electronic intelligence assets were on the ground. In the Azerbaijani case, rocket systems, artillery pieces, they did most of the killing, but they were closely integrated for intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance with the drones. So overall, we had network-centric warfare. We don't have that in the Ukrainian case. In these cases, both Turkey and Azerbaijan used drones for the suppression of Syrian and Armenian air defenses. In the Azerbaijani case, operational tempo was really impressive, like 40 pieces of mobile air defense systems in 10 days. We don't see that sensor fusion, lack of sensor fusion with the Russians. Secondly, and I think this is more important, Turkey fighting with Turkish drones and Ukraine fighting with Turkish drones are two different things. The Turkish military across the spectrum enjoys drones in three-digit numbers. We have a robust defense technological and industrial base. Even for systems like Akıncı, in peacetime conditions, we can produce up to 2 or 3 platforms per month. Ukraine is not able to do that. So it has an arsenal, a modest arsenal of Turkish drones, and that's it. Yes, they have a co-production deal for Bayraktar TB2, but they cannot replace spare parts, Aselsan-made spare parts. Roketsan, smart munitions manufacturer, plays a very important role here. Turkey does not certify foreign munitions on its drones, and it allows a limited number of munitions granted. So Ukraine does not have what we call operational sovereignty. The last thing is doctrine. So in the Turkish armed forces, we see a systematic integration between drones and fire support units, between drones and counterterrorism units. We have no open source clue suggesting the same for the Ukrainians. And last sentence, last point, you know, it is not about drones, it is about facilities. These assets are inherently reliant on runways, in airports, military air bases, so on. So the Russians, as we see from the build-up, they have deployed a really huge deal of long-range fighters, ranging from Iskander missiles to heavy multiple launch rocket systems. And at the very outset of the conflict, it is very likely that the Russians would go for the facilities that would allow drone warfare operations. We didn't see the Syrians attacking Turkish drone base in Batman or the Armenians hitting Azerbaijani drone bases. So it's going to be a very different setting, I'm afraid.
That's a great response, John. It is absolutely crystal clear, as you always are, that, you know, in this case, however many drones the Ukrainian side has purchased from Turkey, it's not going to be decisive if Russia decides on a major military operation. I mean, I think back to, again, after the Turkish operations in northwest Syria, the Royal United Services Institute published an article you and I have discussed, John, that's suggested that the main battle tank could be rendered obsolete because of what Turkey had done in integrating its drone strikes together with all of its combined arms operations. If a defender doesn't have the necessary electronic warfare capabilities to camouflage its armor, that was the case during the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War, and as you said, we saw how devastatingly Azerbaijan was able to apply this combination of innovative tactics and technologies to take out Russian S-300s, suppress the air defense systems, as well as Armenian armor. Going up against a Russian military that decides to again invade Ukraine is a whole different situation, because the Russian military will have those capabilities at its disposal. And even so, Ukraine lacks the doctrine and it lacks the numbers of drones to have an impact other than against the separatists in Donbass. I mean, in a nutshell, did I get that right, dear John?
Definitely. One thing, what might have been different in an ideal world, in a different scenario? So Uh, we have tactical and medium altitude long endurance systems, medium range systems in very civilian terms in the Ukrainian arsenal right now. So we have now in a critical mass of Turkish drone manufacturing, and we are shifting towards more strategic end systems like Aksungur of TUSAŞ, like Akıncı, the Raider of Baykar company. So in an ideal world, say that this is 2030, and we know that there is one nation who procured, we don't know what that, which nation that is, but we know that one nation procured Turkish Akıncı, they signed for Turkish Akıncı. I guess it is either Ukraine or Azerbaijan that Turkey would grant such a technology right after the Turkish military. So that Akıncı drone has something. That Akıncı drone is able to carry some indigenous cruise missile with a range more than 200 kilometers. I think the Ukrainian problem right now is, and here I also want to extend a little bit criticism to the Western aid to the Ukrainian military, because I think that from a military standpoint, that aid is expecting a second Grozny. It's a repetition of what happened in Chechnya. They are tailor-made for urban warfare. They are aimed at supporting the Ukrainian military in their stand in an urban setting. And I think if war happens, if the war comes, the battle space would be very different than the first and second Russo-Chechen war. I think the Ukrainians need more intelligence support, more C2, more command control elements. They need more information superiority enabling elements if they're going to counter the Russians, not a replication of Grozny, but in the operational sense, the problem is now we see the Russian forces in the assembly areas, what we call in military terms, waiting to be ordered to their jumping off points. The Ukrainian long-range fires is really limited. We are talking about Tochka ballistic missiles with maximum range of 120 kilometers if they are the latest variant. And the Russians are simply out of the range of the Ukrainian fires right now. And from assembly areas to jumping off points deep into the Ukrainian territory, I think the Russians will find some marge de maneuver, some freedom of space, and this is really dangerous for the Ukrainian military. In an ideal world, if this was taking place in 2030, and if Ukraine were operating Akıncı drones, equipped with more than 200 kilometers range Turkish cruise missiles, some cruise missiles. Now that could have been a different story. I don't mean that could allow the Ukrainians to win the war, but score some important kills to the armed forces of the Russian Federation in their initial breakpoints. And that would enable the Ukrainians also to hit the logistics of the armed forces of the Russian Federation. I think this is the second important point for everybody who is helping Ukraine right now, because the deeper the Russians would go into Ukraine, the longer their logistics lines would be. And I think this is if there is a chance for the Ukrainian general staff, more than the Russian combat formations in the front lines, but the logistical lines. These will be and the lines of communications. These will be really important. And in an ideal world, with Turkish drones like Akıncı and long-range munitions like some cruise missile, we could have been talking about a different story.
But we're not. Ukraine didn't develop those capabilities. So the bottom line seems to be that those Turkish drone sales to Ukraine really aren't going to have much of an impact on the battlefield, but they have had a political impact. And I'm going to come back to Yevgenia on this because, as I mentioned during my introductory remarks, the sale of these Turkish drones to Ukraine has gotten under the skin of Vladimir Putin, and he has raised it with President Erdogan. I noted that the next day, I think it was Defense Minister Hulusi Akar said, well, we're going to go ahead and continue our drone sales to Ukraine no matter what. And in fact, going back to Fahrettin Altun, who I mentioned at the beginning, President Erdogan's, or the government's press spokesman, he summarized President Erdogan's views on the eve of this visit to Kyiv by saying, we're not supplying the drones to Ukraine to try to escalate tensions, to paraphrase, but we're not going to cut off the drone sales either because Russia is upset about them. So let's get back to the question of whether or not Turkey can be a mediator. So Erdogan is there now. From Putin's perspective, that's not. It's a very unfriendly action. By the same token, it's been announced that President Putin is going to visit Turkey. He accepted the invitation at some point later this month. So what are your instincts telling you, Yevgenia, as to whether or not Turkey can play this mediator role? I mean, initially, Dmitry Peskov Putin's press spokesman, as I recall, had said that he had said we don't need Turkish mediation. But then I think it was Minister Lavrov said, well, if Turkey can convince Ukraine to fulfill its Minsk Accords commitments, then maybe we'd be in favor of it. And then President Zelensky has welcomed Turkish mediation. But then again, Turkish mediation at this moment where, President Biden and NATO are squaring off and trying to deter the Russian bear, and Putin is trying to escalate tension and pressure. Is there a space for Turkey to play that mediation role?
Well, actually, starting from what John said, just as we say here in Ukraine very often, the best way to win a war is to prevent it, and not only in Ukraine but everywhere. So basically, I would say that in this regard, Turkish drones definitely will not be a game changer in the battlefield, and no one in Ukraine has this naive expectation that a couple of drones, if those are a new generation drone or whatever it is, can actually solve our problems. The game-changing role of drones is in political support and diplomatic support, and that's a very important political message also to Moscow, that in case something happens, Turkey will not be just watching how it's all going on somewhere there in Ukraine, but actually Turkey reminded that it is a nation, a NATO nation, a NATO member, and even with all the problems and some kind of complicated relations Ankara now has with its Western partners, in such situations with the crisis in relations with Russia, always what we hear from Turkey is that we will act in accordance with our NATO commitments. So we will support Ukraine's sovereignty, and we will also act together with our NATO partners. And I think in this regard, it's more this political message rather than kind of operational sovereignty and whatever that helps us a lot, and that increases pressure of Russia. And these drones are really not for the escalation, but rather for the de-escalation. Because whenever and whatever vulnerabilities Russia can see, if we are really weak in sending those signals from the very beginning, then it will be Russia who will actually escalate and go forward. So here, I believe that it's really important to understand the logics behind the actions of the Ukrainian leadership, that those drones even we need not that much for the combat operations in the urban areas, but rather for reconnaissance activities, for gathering intelligence, as you mentioned. And if you remember, and I might remind to our audience that it was only once time in history that actually Ukraine used that drone for a combat purpose in the Donbas region. And then the narrative, which was promoted everywhere on Russian TV channels and globally by kind of Russia Today and Sputnik and whatever, that Ukraine is kind of using Turkish drones to kill civilians. So that's definitely not what we want to see. And for us, what is important is to be able to get the grasp of the situation, to have this reconnaissance also with the help of Turkish drones. But then we should not forget that we have almost 8 years of combat experience with Russians. And basically, Ukraine is the only country in Europe which has this real combat experience vis-a-vis Russians. And getting back to the question of mediation, well, I do believe that Turkey is well positioned for that role, because on the one hand, being a NATO member, and on the other hand, having this working relationship with Russia, Turkey is quite experienced in doing this delicate balancing in between two sides of the story. And that's, as you mentioned, that's not something new. That's a historical, very long historical record of Turkey's soft balancing between Russia, which is actually a rivalry, a strategic rival, right, for Turkey in the Black Sea Basin, starting from the Russian-Ottoman Wars, or whatever period of time you want to take. And on the other hand, of NATO, which is being regarded as a threat to Turkish national security by most of Turkish population. And if you look at some kind of polls or whatever research you have in Turkey, then it will not be Armenia, it will not be Greece, it will not even be Russia. That will be actually the United States or NATO, which is very often regarded as a threat. So here I think that Turkey will try to stick to this balancing policy, trying to test the waters and to see how much of compromise from each side it can get. There are definitely some kind of red lines like the territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, non-recognition of the annexation of Crimea and so on. But on some other issues like Minsk Accords, for example, I believe that Turkey might try to try a bit of soften Ukrainian position, whether we can somehow actually we are implementing our commitments under the Minsk Accords and agreements, but some of the points which are very often mentioned by Russians, for example, like getting elections there, or before the withdrawal of forces, or getting back to this table of diplomatic negotiation. Those are some points where which can be discussed. But here again, I think it's a lot depends on the position of Russian Federation, because from Ukraine side, we welcome to that gesture. Turkey is definitely ready because it will play anyhow for in Turkey's interests. I mean, in terms of regional influence, in terms of maintaining relations with Russia and with Ukraine. But the question is whether Russia will actually accept that invitation. And it seems to me now that Putin himself still does not know whether he's willing to accept that invitation or not, because a lot will depend on the dynamics in the dialogue between Moscow and Washington, Moscow and Brussels, and depending on what Putin get or cannot get in that direct dialogue, the kind of additional extra option from Turkish government might be considered.
Yeah, despite Turkey wanting, thank you, Evgenia, that's a great answer. I mean, despite Turkey really wanting to play that role of mediator, and by the way, if you log on to Daily Sabah, so you know, the English language newspaper in Turkey, you'll see like every time, almost every time you log into an article today, there's one that pops up on the side. It's about Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu's efforts, and it's successfully together with Finland to create a UN supported initiative to promote mediation of conflicts around the world. So Turkey really has this aspiration. But as you've said, Evgenia, maybe Turkey's already performing the mediation without the formal mediation forum in place by virtue of its actions. And maybe, you know, it's going to be up to ultimately to Moscow to decide whether it wants Turkey to play a more active role. And I would agree with you. For now, it doesn't seem like Moscow really wants that. And I'm not even sure how much Turkey would ever be willing to resist Russian aggressive tendencies because of its historical balancing act against Russia, with Russia forever, eternally having its sights set on the Turkish Straits, and Turkey and Russia, or Turkey fighting more wars back to the Ottoman centuries against Russia and the Russian Empire than against any other country. So John, before I'm going to turn to Deborah in a second with an energy question, but one last sort of current and historical question for you that has to do with the security side in the Black Sea. How much do you, and I know I'm not asking for a number, 7 or 9, but how willing do you think Turkey might be to resist Russia's growing assertiveness, not just in the context of this current crisis between Russia and Ukraine, but also in light of the last 8 years, since 2014 and Russia's first invasion of Ukraine, or most recent invasion of Ukraine, Russia's efforts to secure the Black Sea as a sort of anti-access area denial region, so A2AD. How much does that worry Turkey?
Well, it should. I think it worries Turkey to some extent, but I think it should worry Turkey more than it is right now. First, Crimea is not about Crimea. Crimea and 2014 Crimea is the reason that the Russians have that much power projection capability in the Mediterranean right now. They don't have an organic Mediterranean fleet, and all the activity that we see off the Syrian coast, including the submarine activity in Tartus, which is really critical. At one time, I recall my team with open source intelligence, we counted at least 5 submarines in the Tartus space. It turned into some kind of hub, and it was all being supported from the Black Sea. The entire Russian maritime operations off the Syrian coast, and the bulk of the logistics is happening from Black Sea. So Crimea is about that. This is the thing I always voice, including my time when I was with NATO Defense College. I always try to warn NATO circles about that. The dichotomy between the eastern flank and the southern flank is over right now. The weapon systems that Ukrainians are facing right now are being tested in Syria, more than 300 weapon systems. In the southern flank, what Turkey is facing right now is stemming from the Black Sea region, Crimea. So we don't have that eastern and southern flank dichotomy anymore. The Russians abolished that dichotomy themselves. How Turkey can resist that, and to what extent it can resist that's the million-dollar question. But I can say that Ukraine, and the reason that Turkey is so concerned about Ukraine, even it urged President Erdogan to pay a visit to Kiev, is that we had a level of compartmentalization between Russia and Turkey that we didn't see in the Western diplomacy. You are a career diplomat, Matt, and you know the difference of DC and the State Department when handling Turkey affairs and the Russians. We are at odds with the Russians in Karabakh. We are at odds with the Russians in Syria. They never ever make Turkey pay a visit to Crimea, President Erdogan or anybody. They could never be able to seize Turkish support to Georgia even after 2008. And they could never ever move Turkey 1 inch closer to recognizing Assad. But they compartmentalize all those, and when Turkey asked for the S-400, for instance, they acted very differently than the Western counterparts. We saw that Turkish-American problems, geopolitical divergences in other parts of the world, easily translated into arms transactions. It is even more pronounced with the Europeans, but the Russians are so good at compartmentalizing it. We are at odds in Karabakh, it is in Karabakh. We are at odds in Syria, it is about Syria. The S-400 is a different story. They are really manageable and easygoing about that. But I think Ukraine is the place that we can see this compartmentalization coming to an end, because all the problems that I have mentioned and not mentioned hitherto were actually about either proxy wars like Libya, or indirect affairs, or places that are not in the Russians' first tier sphere of influence, if you like, or the area that they call the area of privileged interest. For the first time in Ukraine, I think Turkey sees that now in a Cold War fashion. It is either NATO or the Soviet Union or Warsaw Pact. Turkey might come to a point that it has to pick a clear side. I think that side would be Ukraine. But that would mark the very end of the compartmentalization with Russia, because Ukraine is not Syria. Hurting Wagner in Libya is not tantamount to hurting the Russian formations along the Ukrainian border. In the eyes of the Kremlin elite, Ukraine is way more different than Syria. So I think this is the end of the story of compartmentalization with Russia if it goes to war.
I mean, I want to listen to that response on the recording, John, about 100 times. There was so much richness in your response, and the concept that Crimea is not just the aircraft carrier for Russia now, but it's supporting naval operations in the Mediterranean is amazing, and also the sort of the fact that Turkey is the geographic connective tissue now between NATO's eastern flank and southern flank, but also between the heartland of Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean is an amazing insight. And yeah, Turkey is that's the whole point. It's going to have to make a choice. It can no longer just try to thread that needle and wiggle between its NATO obligations and having a decent relationship with Russia. And, I think that it may be, Ankara may be catching on to what Secretary Blinken said during his confirmation hearing a year ago, when he was asked, is there any policy of the Trump administration that the Biden administration would continue? And his reply was yes, military technological support to Ukraine. So this is something where there maybe is a natural way that Ukraine and Turkey are going to work together in a way that's going to catch the attention of Washington. So just as you were saying. On the other hand, Turkey's sort of foreign policy brand remains toxic in Washington. So speaking of Washington, I'll turn back to Deborah for a moment and ask her a question from Dennis Santiago, who's a journalist with Red State. And it's also to you, John. From a purely self-interest perspective, tensions between a U.S.-led Western alliance and Russia that result in economic sanctions could result in Turkey being a beneficiary of the need to reroute oil and gas supplies away from Russian sources to Middle Eastern ones, right? We were kind of talking about that. How does this figure into the calculus of Turkey's potential participation in brokering negotiations between the West, so NATO and the EU on the one hand, and Russia on the other hand? Deborah, let's go to you first.
I have a couple of things that if I can't help myself because of all
Yeah.
these years working military wars and conflicts. The first thing is, Ukraine doesn't have to have battle space superiority. It just has to have enough to make Russia really hurt. And I think that's a fundamental point. The second point I want to make is that both NATO and the EU and Russia ignore Turkey at their own peril. And I think the whole conversation about the importance of the Black Sea, the inability of the United States and its allies to recognize the incredible role Turkey has in the Black Sea, not just for military, but for commerce, energy, etc., that gateway to the Mediterranean, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, I think is all really critically important. And I think neither the United States nor its allies nor Russia have understood this about Turkey and have tried to put Erdogan on a little shelf someplace, much to their own peril. The third piece of this is Russia needs Turkey and this Western market as much as they need Russia. So right now, those oil and gas prices are extremely high because of the rebound of the pandemic. But the fact is, Russia used to have, it earned, I think it was 35 to 40% of its economy was based on, GDP was based on fossil fuels and fossil fuel byproducts. That number has gone up to almost 50% because of what Russia's done in the market. So the reason why Russia can afford to keep 120,000 troops sitting everywhere, where I can have 13 amphibious vessels off of Crimea, that transited the Bosphorus recently. The reason why Russia can do exercises in the South China Sea with China, why it can do exercises in the Mediterranean with Iran, is because the price of these petrochemicals are so high right now. So I think it's a misnomer to always say that Russia is going to be in the driver's seat, because Russia's military adventures usually follow or coincide with high prices in the fossil fuel market. And they don't coincide as much when those prices are down. Russian exercises go down. Russia flights that interfere with other people's borders go down. Even the activities out of Tartus and Latakia, as you mentioned, they're not quite as active. And so I think we sometimes get carried away in thinking this is a never-ending peace. And yes, Vladimir Putin is more than willing to starve his own people to do whatever he wants. But there is a connection between these high prices for oil and gas right now and their byproducts and what Putin's able to do and this global projection that he's trying to do right now. So I wanted to make that point. I do think that we in Washington, I do think NATO writ large has to look at Turkey more seriously in the Black Sea and what its energy capabilities are. Can it provide other links and other pipelines? That's more difficult because Gazprom has done a very good job of creating a little monopoly and controlling flows through pipelines. It's not supposed to under competition rules, but it does. So I think for the short term, that's a little more questionable of what it can do in that regard, to answer the gentleman's question. But I do think there are a whole lot of other things that can happen with Turkey as a NATO Black Sea power, and I don't use the word power lightly, that we're not looking at, that can include if not through pipelines, transit of gas through other kinds of vessels and the like, especially as they might come out of the Eastern Mediterranean. And I don't think we have broadened that base large enough to do this. We've spent our time, the US government has spent its time sort of tin cupping its way to Saudi Arabia, to Qatar, to others to plus up this production while not doing enough at home on this. But by the same token, I think the United States, NATO, and Russia all ignoring Turkey and its potential here is at their own peril.
Okay. Yeah, and I very much agree, Deborah, with your point about, as I was saying in the beginning, who's dependent on whom. Russia is as dependent on Turkey for natural gas revenues as Turkey is on Russian natural gas. Turkey does have diversified supply options. Granted, it's all a matter of how much you want to pay. But one of those is US LNG, and that's a good lead into the next question I want to ask. But John, I just wondered if you wanted to comment on that at all.
Not to the political side, I think Deborah covered it very well, but on the necessity or whether the Ukrainian military necessarily has the upper hand in the battle space to hurt the Russians. I agree. I don't think they have to have the utmost superiority. They cannot actually, given their means right now. But they got one problem, and they might have one window of opportunity. The problem is, looking at the map, the Russian buildup is so dispersed, and Belarus is helping that a lot by keeping the Ukrainian defense forces in and around the capital Kiev, that the concentration of the Ukrainian military is, I think, heavily disrupted right now because of the Russian buildup and the geographical dispersion of the Russian buildup. The Ukrainians might have an opportunity from a military standpoint. The one opportunity could be, as Deborah mentioned, we have a lot of naval buildup in Crimea, and some of those buildup belongs to amphibious operations units. We know that 155th Brigade from the Pacific Fleet is in the area of operations right now. They have an organic Crimean naval infantry unit also. Odessa might be a target, and theoretically speaking, if that amphibious force cannot link up with the main bulky invasion force coming from the east, they're in trouble. They can be easily enveloped by the Ukrainian forces, and these are elite units. If the Ukrainians can envelop those forces, it would be a real blow to the Russians, and they're gonna get hurt. VDV, their airborne operations units, are another really elite, really warfighting capable, but if they exercise behind front lines airborne operations, they can be susceptible to envelopment. But as to regular formations, I think the both political leadership and Shoigu, Gerasimov military leadership would be okay to just witness losses in the hands of the Ukrainian military. I think they are not so prone to casualties, especially in that part of their geopolitical understanding.
Brutal. Okay, Yevgenia, let's get your thoughts as well.
Yeah, just two short comments on what Deborah mentioned and then on what John said. Well, I do agree that the role of Turkey in the Black Sea region is quite underestimated from the NATO's perspective. Now that we are in this process before Madrid summit with the NATO Strategic Concept 2030, we have so many discussions here in Ukraine about what might be the role for the Black Sea region within this new strategic concept. And what we often see is basically for NATO, very often the Black Sea is kind of a important place, important region, the Black Sea Basin, but it's still somewhere on the sidelines. And then there are territorial waters of three NATO member states in the Black Sea. And now, basically, it is not enough to have only some kind of visits to Ukrainian ports or some other ports, or as a political message, political signal. That's, of course, very important. But still, we need a coherent policy of NATO in the Black Sea region, a coherent Black Sea strategy. And in this regard, I believe that that would really be important to get Turkey on board here to play its constructive role and also to kind of consolidate Turkey's own pro-Western identity. So not only to see Turkey as a problem maker for NATO, but also to see where Turkey can contribute. And I believe that the Black Sea region will be the place to play that role. And second point on what John mentioned, what happens here in Ukraine matters a lot for NATO, for Turkey, for a lot of countries, for Japan, for example, because it's not only about Ukraine, it's not only about Russian military grouping somewhere on the borders. It's also about Russian mindset, about Russian desire to change the whole world order, and then it's also about the hybrid warfare. So let us not forget that very often Ukraine is kind of a laboratory for all kind of weapons, kinetic, non-kinetic means used by Russia, which can then be applied in all different parts of the world. So starting from cyber attacks up to the information, disinformation, electronic warfare, and so on. So it's really important in this regard to understand that whatever is now happening here in Ukraine and around Ukraine and the implications of this situation, it's not only actually in this triangle, Russia, Ukraine, Turkey, but it has much broader geopolitical implications because we can see the same patterns of Russian behavior in all different regions of the world, in the Baltics, in Poland, in whatever other region. So that's really important to keep in mind, I believe.
Yeah, I was going to raise a different question now, but that's Evgenia. You've brought us to a perfect point. I have to raise. I have to ask this following question, especially given I think back to how sort of cleverly Foreign Minister Çavuşoğlu reacted after he met Foreign Minister Lavrov a few weeks ago, when he was asked, "Does Turkey support NATO membership for Ukraine?" And the Foreign Minister said, "We support the enlargement of NATO." Full stop, meaning Ukraine and Georgia. So I want to ask you a question, and everybody, but back to you about Georgia, since you just mentioned about how this experience in Ukraine is being replicated in other regions as well. And this is from an old friend, Hans Gutbrod, now associate professor at Ilyas State University. And this is also, of course, to Deborah, but John as well, all of you. What about Georgia? If the Kremlin decided to cross the Rubicon in Ukraine, many in Georgia, of course, worry the gloves would be entirely off for Georgia, which is the country separating Russia and Turkey. What are the scenarios and what might be the red lines? And I'd like to add as well that the Georgia Dream Party and the government have not mentioned, even the parliament, have not mentioned Russia at all in their statements of concern about what's happening in Ukraine. It's as if a ghost is out there creating problems, a ghost who shall not be mentioned somehow magically in Ukraine. So I throw that to Evgeny, since you were just speaking about this, to you, and then to Deborah, and then to John.
Well, definitely Georgia is a part of this bigger picture, and I believe that if we had had a different reaction from the West back in 2008, we might not have had the 2014 situation in Crimea and Russia. And our problem is that we failed actually to show this complete picture from the very beginning, treating the cases of Ukraine and Georgia as kind of different cases. The problem with Russia is that the main catastrophe of the 20th century, as Putin put it, is the dissolution of the Soviet Union. So what Russia is trying to do now is actually to recreate the Soviet Union edition 2.0. And it's not only about Ukraine and Georgia, because it's the same with Belarus, like its de facto, let's say, annexation of Belarus recently, which we witnessed, and then the deployment of forces in Kazakhstan, mainly Russian forces as well, and then Armenia, which is completely dependent on Russia. So it's a whole wide geography where Russia is trying to play its upper hand. In this regard, basically Turkey supports, and very often it's very vocal about its support of NATO membership for Ukraine and Georgia, just because this is the case, not to see a much more assertive and aggressive Russia close to its borders without having any other countries which would be able also to deter Russia and to counterbalance it. Now, the answers might be a bit different just because of the timing. I mean, given the ultimatum of Putin to the West, it would be a bit naive to wait from like Çavuşoğlu or some other political leadership in Turkey to come up and say that we strongly support Ukraine's and Georgia's membership in NATO just in this very moment. But if you look back at all different kind of strategic documents and declarations of the previous summits with Ukraine, on each and every occasion, Turkey has been very vocal about its strong support for Ukraine's full membership in NATO. And now we're working closely on implementing NATO standards in Ukrainian armed forces, on all kinds of reforms in the military sector. But the full membership is also something that is traditionally very much supported by Turkey. So here again, it's important to get the whole picture and not only to be focused on Ukraine as a particular case of Russian aggression.
Yeah, point well taken. I recall also in August of 2008, just days after Russia had invaded Georgia, then President Saakashvili said, Crimea is next. And he was 6 years prescient. Yeah. Deborah, I'd like to turn to you for your thoughts, putting on your old POLAD hat, as well as EURRPM. And by the way, there's a mutual friend of ours, Mehmet Organ, who was Admiral Giambastiani's special assistant when you were POLAD, that sends his regards. But please, let's hear your thoughts, building on what Evgenia just said.
Well, I think what Evgeny said is absolutely correct. But this goes back to what I think was a strategic error at the beginning of the Biden administration, which was to make this assumption that all roads to Europe go through Berlin. And I think by saying that, it allowed Germany to set the table in a way that fit German priorities, but not necessarily the priorities of the rest of NATO. And, you know, we know the history here of Germany's view toward giving Georgia any NATO membership or even the MAP program. We know the history of turning a blind eye to what the Russians did early on in Moldova's independence, because we talk about Georgia, we talk about Ukraine, but we forget that there's anywhere between 1,000 and 2,000 Russian troops sitting in Transnistria, which is sitting on Romania's border, another, you know, NATO member, and then we go to Ukraine. So I think that was a huge error because, from my perspective, the road to Europe doesn't necessarily go through Berlin. It goes through Warsaw, or it goes through, or it goes through Bucharest, or it goes through Vilnius. It doesn't necessarily have to go through Berlin. And when you make it go through Berlin, then you start doing things that go with this German approach to this, which has not been helpful to Georgia, which has not been helpful to Ukraine, and really not very helpful to this part of NATO's flank, and has been absolute anathema to Turkey as well, I will say. So I wanted to say that first. So I think we need, for lack of a better term, and this is a bad one, a reset in how we deal with NATO's flank countries. The United States has, on a permanent basis, over 60,000 forces deployed to Europe. Sometimes it goes as high as 80, depending on exercises and the like. Only 6,000 of them are deployed east of Berlin, is what I like to say. So we talk about this reinforcement of 3,000 from the United States and the like, but the fact of the matter is, a lot of these forces could have been moved to other places east of Berlin for quite some time. And they weren't. It was almost like this static element. And I think that's a really important number to remember, because there's still a lot more that NATO can do that would show that it is committed to this open door policy. And I thought what the Turks said about this was absolutely brilliant, you know. But I do also think that we're still letting policies made by a new and not very well-organized government in Berlin having too much power in terms of what happens to those countries who have to live in the neighborhood. And And I think it's really important that when you look at the countries who have to live in the neighborhood, their perspective is obviously going to be different than someone sitting in Berlin who's saying, I need to sell all these Mercedes and BMWs to Moscow and Beijing. And I'll
and get my gas as well. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's a perennial problem. Those crazy East Europeans like me as a Polish American who are all anti-Russian, or is it just that they know they know the history better? And we're coming up against about a 13-minute from now deadline. There's another question I very much want to ask to take a totally different perspective. But John, I just wanted to see if you wanted to add anything on this last round. Don't feel obligated. It's okay if there's anything else you wanted to add. No? Okay. So this discussion so far has proceeded from the assumption that Turkey playing a more active role, whether it be as a mediator or as NATO's second largest military, is a good thing. But let's take a different perspective. And so we have a question from a Greek friend, Athanasios Kosmopoulos, who's data protection officer in the Ministry of Digital Policy in Greece. So his comment and question is, the important issue is to underline that Turkey is no longer a credible ally of NATO, but rather an irresponsible actor for the security and stability of the southeastern flank of NATO, following the Russian hybrid doctrine. So how do you comment on that? Anybody who wishes. John, please.
Thank you. Well, I'm going to go very straightforward with that. But I recall the first time that we met with you in person was in a TRT show, if you recall. Yeah.
Yep. And you invited me to Berlin to SWP. Yes.
And that was a follow-on. But TRT thing is important because we were there to talk about the S-400 procurement and the F-35 issues, so on. And for starters, TRT is the state-owned television of the television channel of Turkey. So on the state, for my entire career, I objected the S-400 procurement. I thought that out of technical reasons, it is not the best option, even not a good option for Turkey. And on the TRT world broadcast, even I voiced that on the state-owned television. But the thing is also about Turkey being a reliable NATO ally, not reliable NATO ally. I'm going to be equally firm here. Reducing every single thing about Turkey's NATO identity to the S-400 procurement and turning a blind eye to everything else, I think is analytically flawed. Turkey flew air policing mission last year. Turkey was the framework nation for the Very High Readiness Joint Task Force, which is NATO's primary spearhead response force to hybrid threats. Turkey was the Turkish military was the framework for that, the lead nation for that force. I'm looking at some NATO allies' reactions to what's happening in Ukraine right now, and I'm just assuming, had Ukraine been a NATO member as we are talking, or if these were happening along the Polish border, could the Ukrainian people rely on Turkey that if Article 5 is invoked, the Turkish military will be there for them? And if it comes to Article 5 invoked in the North Atlantic Council, would the Turkish leadership show that strong resilience for a NATO ally? I'm putting myself in the shoes of the Ukrainians. I'm putting myself in the shoes of the Polish. I do think that I could rely on Turkey, but I cannot say the same for every single NATO nation. I wouldn't want to point out anybody in Europe right now, but looking at having a checklist of allied cohesion, having a checklist of siding with NATO allies, and having a checklist of sending 5,000 helmets to the Ukrainian military and selling armed drones, combat-proven armed drones to Ukrainian military without any geographical limitations, such as you cannot use them in Donbass, I think it speaks for itself. So is Turkey a good NATO ally? I think it would be wise to go ask the Baltic nations, to the Polish, which NATO ally do they think, if it comes to that point, would be there for them. I think it is important, and I think any poll in the Ukrainian landscape would show it. And it brings us to the second question, the second point about that. I'm not going to give. I will not just go again diplomatic with that, but I would quote George Friedman, an important thinker of the US strategic community. He once said, NATO essentially is a military alliance. The first prerequisite of having or being a military alliance is to have a military. So we have some NATO nations who do not have real militaries. Even if they want to field some forces to Ukraine, in an ideal world, if Ukraine were to be a NATO member, they do not have enough combat readiness or enough divisions to deploy in the Ukrainian frontier. So I think if we are talking about NATO allies and questioning Turkey's position as a NATO ally, I think we should first better keep the light on NATO allies without real militaries, keeping in mind that NATO is a military alliance, essentially.
Mm-hmm.
So this is my most non-diplomatic answer to that. Thank you.
It was actually a very diplomatic answer. Yeah. George Friedman, by the way, also famously predicted about 15 years ago that Turkey and the United States will fight a big war and Turkey will prevail. But that's a whole different topic. We touched on Berlin just in the last couple of questions. And John, I mean, that was, as I said, you and I ended up meeting again in Berlin, thanks to your invitation. So there are many good questions left, but one pertains to Germany. And I'll just read it, but just as a sign of respect, but I think it's already been answered, but it's Dr. Joel Hillison of the U.S. Army War College. He says, the top importers of Russian natural gas is Turkey working with German and other NATO nations to coordinate leverage against Russia during this crisis. Relations with Germany have been rocky at best, but a coordinated response might increase Allied leverage. I think we all agree that a coordinated response with Germany would increase the Allied leverage. But as John just said, Germany's bit of military assistance to send 5,000 helmets to Ukraine, which Evgenia and your fellow citizens of Ukraine have recognized as really isn't all that helpful and all that supportive, and there's not much.
That could be a game changer. 5,000 helmets and the Ukrainian military, that could be a game changer. I think that's Allied solidarity textbook example.
He says facetiously, yes. So I'm looking at, as we were coming close to the end of time and realizing how important deadlines are for our journalistic friends. And I'm a huge fan of Voice of America. So I'd like to pose a question of Eugene Komarov, specific but important, which is, do you expect Ukraine and Turkey to sign a framework agreement on manufacturing Turkish drones in Ukraine? Ukrainian Defense Minister Reznikov told a briefing ahead of the visit by President Erdogan on Thursday that is likely to happen. So very focused question. What do you think?
Yes, actually, we had that statement, and most probably it was signed. We cannot check it because while we are speaking here, the ceremony is taking place in Kiev, but most probably it will be signed. That is not a particular agreement or document on manufacturing of drones per se, but on cooperating in the military sphere and on defense technologies. And one of the projects within the general framework of that agreement on the military and defense cooperation would be also about the joint manufacturing of drones, but also aircrafts, space technologies, and so on. So most probably it has been signed, and we'll be able to talk about it later, but it definitely was on the agenda, and that was one of the cornerstones of today's meeting between the presidents in Kiev.
Thank you. Very clear. I see Daphne. Daphne, does it mean can we ask one more question, or is it time?
I think we have time for one more. Go ahead.
Okay. Then in out of respect to a former ambassadorial counterpart, Ambassador Dodo Kostia from Romania, he's a member of the Scientific Council of New Strategy Center in Bucharest. And by the way, I'm sorry for the other questions we didn't get to ask. There's very, very thoughtful ones. Some have to do with what calculus is working in, Putin's head, which is maybe more appropriate for another forum. Others about how more on how far Turkey is willing to push. But getting back to wrap up with mediation or facilitation, Ambassador Kostia says a mediator, as opposed to a facilitator, would imply that the actor, the initiator, has something to offer to the respective parties to persuade them to move forward towards an agreeable solution. So what might Turkey be able to offer? What could Turkey put on the table diplomatically to convince the two sides to, I guess, in this case, to de-escalate?
Well, I might start answering the question. That's a great one, because very often there is just a confusion about all this mediation facilitation and then only kind of suggesting different platforms for physical meeting of different parties, which are all different formats. So now basically what we are talking about are two main tracks. One is physically taking the location for the meetings of the trilateral contact group from Minsk, which is no more an option for Ukraine, even politically, if not logistically, to, let's say, Istanbul. And this is something which is now negotiated in the framework of the OC mission as well, of C in general. It's still under consideration now because Russians do not want to accept that. So that might be one thing where Turkey is very vocal about willing to actually provide the space for those negotiations going on. The second one would be creating a different platform and a different format, like it was, for example, with the Astana, which developed in parallel with the Geneva talks. And that would be a very different track. I'm not sure we're still on the stage where we can discuss the particular moments and particular details of that new format, but I believe what Turkey can now be efficient in is a second track diplomacy. So it's not necessarily only the official context. It might be really difficult to get Putin and Zelensky at the same table, but doing all these kind of second track diplomacy, shuttle diplomacy, conveying messages from Moscow to Kiev, from Kiev to Moscow, and vice versa, that might be okay for all sides, because there is no reaction to Turkey in Kremlin like there is a reaction to the United States or Brussels or whatever. So in this regard, Ankara is not toxic for the Kremlin, let's say. So being this kind of a messenger in between all sides would be the option, I would say. For more, we'll need effort from the Russian side, and I do not see a space for that at the moment, frankly.
Great insight. I'm looking in John's eyes and Deborah's. If there's nothing more to add, I'm passing the ball to Daphne. Is that okay? Yeah. Oh.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. Thank you. Great moderation, and I'd like to thank Yevgenia, Deborah, and John. Excellent comments. And what a lively debate this was. And definitely, I'd like to thank also the great audience with great questions. And again, apologies that we couldn't get back to you all because of the time restriction. But please follow us, just on our webpage. We will be, publishing a written summary of the event in the coming days. And still, if you have questions to our panelists, we'll be happy to pass on, just try to get an answer to all of you. And please stay with us, until the next Atlantic Council event, just so looking forward to seeing you all next time. And thank you again for joining.